So my name is Clete Kushida. I'm currently Division Chief and Medical Director at Stanford University. And what led me on this path was back in 1977, I remember I was sitting in my freshman dorm room with my roommate, and then we opened up the Stanford Daily, the college newspaper, and it said, "Are you interested in sleep?" And it was such an intriguing thing in the newspaper that we decided to check it out. So we hopped on our bikes, went over there. We went to the Stanford Center for Human Sleep Research, and it turned out to be Mark Rosekind as well as Dr. Dement. And they were trying to recruit college students to actually study patients with narcolepsy as part of a research study. And any student that volunteered would get academic credit for it. So it sounded intriguing. And what ended up happening was I ended up spending nights predominantly on the weekends to help basically just monitoring the subjects overnight. And I was paired with another investigator named Dr. Wesley Seidel. So he during the night, he would help educate me about sleep. And that prompted me enough to take the course with Dr. Dement, Sleep and Dreams. And at that time, it was just and still is an absolutely fantastic course. And Dr. Mary Karskaden was also there at the time at the base of the anatomy building, also conducting research. And those individuals suggested, "Oh, why don't you also do some research?" So I worked with the narcoleptic dog colony there at the base of the anatomy building, and along with Dr. Dement and Dr. Ted Baker, they helped me actually write my first article on in the sleep field, on the narcoleptic dogs, sort of characterizing the EEG of the cataplectic attacks. So that was my first exposure, and then that led me under the tutelage of Dr. Dement. He said, "Well, why don't you follow my footsteps and go to the University of Chicago?" So that's where he received his MD PhD degrees, and that's where I followed suit. And during that time, I had the privilege of working with Dr. Alan Rexhoff and with the not narcoleptic dogs, but with the rats and sleep deprivation experiments. And then after that, ended up with University of California, San Diego, with Dr. Sonia Ankoli Israel, and Dr. Chris Gillen, who further helped to just train me on sleep. So I've been very fortunate in being able to receive education and training by the true pioneers in the field. Yeah. So so I knew by talking with Bill that he had played such a pivotal role in starting the sleep clinic at Stanford, and then also helping with the initiating the research there as well. In 1970, he started the first sleep clinic at Stanford, but initially it was the focus was primarily with narcolepsy, and then Dr. Christian Guilleminault was there at the time as mainly as a visiting clinician and researcher. But then, that initial fledgling sleep clinic was sort of struggling in the first 2 years. And that's when Dr. Dement reapproached Dr. Guilleminault and said, "Oh, could you come back in 1972 to help jumpstart the clinic?" And that's when it really took off, because then the clinic pivoted from mainly focusing on narcolepsy towards mainly focusing on patients with obstructive sleep apnea, and that really paved the way for really developing the clinic further. And at that time, it was still fairly small. I think they had like 4 beds, and this was like later on, even like the 1980s, they developed it 6 beds. Now it's up to like 18 beds. So it's really advanced over the years, but over a gradual progression. Dr. Guilleminault had this funny story where he came over and he saw this guy on a bulldozer that was sort of shifting the grounds. And then he went up to this individual and said, "Do you know where I can find Dr. Dement?" and this was at the initial time that he came to Stanford. And the guy paused the bulldozer and said, "Well, I'm him. I'm Dr. Dement." I don't know if this was one of Dr. Gimeno's tall tales, but that's how he put it. That was their first meeting, that he saw this strange person on a bulldozer, and it turned out to be Dr. Dement. So that was their first meeting. And over the years, they've almost like brothers. They've had times where they've come together and pulled apart, but always, they've always had mutual respect with one another. And both Dr. Dement and Dr. Gimeno always had fond things to say about either one of them. And Dr. Dement, since he was more senior at Stanford, he really helped Dr. Gimeno along with his career as well at Stanford. I've heard a little bit of this from Dr. Dement, but also from others, that he really felt that there was a need for an organization. And initially what he did was he had brought together a small group of people. I want to say about 12 or so. I can't really recall all the founding members of them, but there was a group of individuals, and it included, I believe, people like Peter Harvey, Mary Karskad, and others, and that's how the initial start of the association was. It started as the the Association of Sleep Disorder Centers, and that gradually over time became the American Academy of Sleep Medicine as it took off. But originally it was a very small group. It was mainly focused on just trying to help educate the general public, and to I think about the same time also looking at how to start up like an exam and training and all that. But it started initially with this small group of individuals. And I think one of the early meetings was held at Stanford. Yes, because at that time, it had to get accepted as a specialty, and also things like reimbursement and all that, as well as just the diagnosis of the disorders hadn't really been worked out. Although with Dr. Gimeno's assistance, that had been started to also germinate as well. So a lot of these topics that seem old hat to us now were just in the incipient stage at that time. Such as things like reimbursement for the sleep studies, how to actually run the sleep studies overnight, how to select the patients for the studies, what are the key diagnostic features of things like sleep apnea, narcolepsy. All of those, just started initially at that time.
So how did you get involved with the organization, with the association?
Yeah, so I actually started, I'd have to think back, but initially it was with the initial examination. So I worked with it was an initial group. It consisted of individuals like Rich Rosenberg, who I actually knew back at the University of Chicago, because at that time that I was a graduate student there, he was there at the same time. So I had known him at that time, and he said, yeah, we're starting to put together an exam. And I became interested in helping out with that. So we would come up with the initial exam that was through the AASM at that point. And then there was also, we also helped to develop it computerized. And that's where Dr. David Rappaport, actually lent a tremendous assistance in that, because he was able to actually have it as a computerized exam. Because for many years, as you recall, it was mainly paper exam and we had to flip through it. But then, gradually became computerized. So that was the first step. That's how I became interested in the academy. And then later on, I was fortunate to be invited. One other step was initially it was called the Standards of Practice Committee, and I was a member of that. And later on, I succeeded Dr. Michael Littner as being the chair of that, and I became very interested in the standards of practice, and then that led to eventually being asked to participate in the board of directors, and so like everyone else that is eventually tapped for leadership roles. I went through the various stages of being on committees and further committees just to see if I was a good fit. At that time, there was also the periods of like the behavioral sleep medicine. It was trying to develop its footing at that time. There was also interest in the international sleep medicine. So I was trying to further that piece along. And then also, in addition to that, there was also the relationship with AASM and SRS trying to foster that. So that's what I recall. That was kind of like during the time that I was on the board and the academy. Those were like some of the key components. At that time, with Jerry Barrett, he was very much interested and entrenched in kind of trying to develop it within domestically, because at that time there was roughly about 15% international students. So what I was trying at that point was to have more of an international footing. So I was working with some of the international groups to try and see if that they would be able to be brought in and to sort of dovetail their needs with that of the domestic membership. And it was a bit of a struggle because there was more of an interest in at that time, most of the members were still with the United States. So it was very hard to have more of an international footing. Yeah, so at that time, sleep medicine outside of the United States, despite some areas that were fairly well developed, there were a lot of pockets that were not well developed, and to this day still remain a little underdeveloped, just because of the way that there's sleep medicine training, the way that sleep studies or visits are reimbursed. There's a whole host of different reasons, but I think the major one is the education and training piece. There just wasn't the standard associations and different there weren't standard organizations in different countries that would help to educate and train. I mean, there were large regional ones like the ESRS, the ASRS, but still within certain pockets in certain countries, it really wasn't. There really wasn't a good way to help educate and train those individuals. Yeah, so I think there was definitely outreach and to try and help. And over the years, there were different mechanisms to try and work to explore. Now, one time the AASM even had a program where they would bring people in, or they would pair them with mentors within the United States. And I believe that lasted about 3 or 4 years. And I don't think it was a lack of interest. It was just a lack of the infrastructure putting it together. So there were, various ways of trying to develop that further. But yeah, it was very difficult, and it still is very difficult to this day. Dr. Dement, in my recollection, it was always, from those future years, always a senior statement, because he's known as the father of sleep medicine, but he also played a pivotal role in also the development of scientific study of sleep as well. So he wore multiple hats, including establishing the training examination, establishing the Association of Sleep Disorder Centers. So many different hats, as well as going repeatedly to Washington. So there were, in all those ways, he was able to nurture the field along. And, one of the things I think that he instilled in everyone that was within his orbit was the need to always put sleep first. I had the opportunity of traveling with him, many times on flights, and while we were waiting at the gate, he would always look around, and when he saw a person that was dozing off, he would actually go up to them and he'd say, excuse me, I saw you're falling asleep. Can you explain, why you were falling asleep? And so there were many instances like that. And he would always try to push the agenda for sleep. And even for myself, I remember one time I was a site visitor for the academy. And then the site visit wasn't supposed to start till 9. And he woke me up at 6 o'clock in the morning. He called me and he asked, what I was doing. I said, I'm a site visitor here. And then he said, well, who's a congressman there? And then what he said was, what you should do is you should get all the staff and all the faculty at that site visit location to go to the congressperson's office. And I kind of was really fussy. I was blah, blah, blah. That type of thing. How am I going to convince, I'm supposed to be there for a site visit. But sure enough, all I did was I said, Dr. Dement, suggested this idea. And just like that, we were able to set up an appointment with the congressperson and bring the entire lab over there in the middle of the site visit. But that's the type of person he was. For one, it was very hard to say no to Dr. Dement, but also he always looked at what was best for the field. And he always considered everyone to do their share in order to advance the field. I had the privilege of working with Dr. Dement on a project that was in Walla Walla, Washington, which was his hometown. And it was very dear to his heart because Dr. Dick Simon, or Richard Simon, was there, and he had a sleep center there, and he helped Dr. Dement helped Dr. Simon help establish that clinic. So in gratitude, Dr. Simon named that the Catherine Severance Dement sleep clinic after Dr. Dement's mother. And we actually did a research project there in Walla Walla looking at primary care, and it was called the Primary Care Training Education Project. It was named PEP for short. And the idea was to look at primary care under a microscope and see how they approach sleep, how they mention sleep to their patients, and how that one of the findings was that sleep was always like one of those handle on the door questions where either the patient would bring it up or the primary care physician would bring it up and about their sleep problems. So he did a lot in terms of helping to educate and train practitioners in various pockets of the United States in sleep medicine, and that because that was one of his passions, to really try to push the training and education of sleep, not only to sleep specialists or junior sleep specialists, but also to practitioners in other disciplines. I know that he was very early on, helping to promote the NCSDR. So he would go to NIH many times and say, you need the development of a separate center to, help advance the agenda of sleep and sleep disorders. So, absolutely. That was just one of the many hats that he wore in order to promote sleep. Working, knowing the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, from the perspective of leadership, one real strong take-home message that I learned is that, even though there are very different opinions about different subjects, and whenever you bring together a group of people that are very passionate and opinionated about sleep, there's always going to be some disagreements. But what I learned over the years, particularly with AASM, is to try and find common ground and to bring things, bring people together to try and find solutions. And it seems kind of trite now, but that was kind of the main take-home lesson that I learned. And it helped me later on in my career to bring together different groups that I thought would never sit together and come together, but eventually did. Just as long as you, to sort of bring back Dr. Dement, to realize that that most people, even though they might have different viewpoints, there is a common agenda of how to make sleep and sleep disorders advance. And with that, you'll always be able to find ways to bring people together. The AASM is a very unique group of individuals. It's a combination of people that are interested in the practice of sleep medicine, but also have an interest in research, clinical research, translational research. So it's really a very dynamic group, because not only are you bringing together sleep specialists and sleep clinicians, but with completely different backgrounds in terms of their specialty training. And when you combine that with sleep technologists, you combine them with dentists who are interested in sleep, other advanced practice providers, it creates a very dynamic environment. And even just last night when I was in the poster session, it just felt so good to be back after the pandemic, just to see just the level of enthusiasm, the level of passion, and to be back completely in person. So if I would characterize that in one word, I would choose the word dynamic, because that's what I see at these meetings. Yeah, one thing I would just like to say is I spent about 8 years at the University of Chicago under the tutelage of Dr. Alan Rechtschaffen, and it was also, just like Dr. Dement, a very formative experience. And Dr. Dement and Dr. Rechtschaffen, they were there at the same time at the University of Chicago. Dr. Alan Rechtschaffen was mainly doing his graduate studies, and Dr. Dement was in the medical side. And you combine that with Dr. Eugene Aserinsky and Dr. Kleitman, so it was a very enriched environment. And so they remain, Dr. Rechtschaffen and Dr. Dement remained very close over the years. And even when they were apart and came together, they would just have the most amazing stories. But the thing I want to highlight about Dr. Alan Rechtschaffen is that in terms of a scientific approach, he was, I just feel he was unparalleled. He would be able to look at a problem and look at it in so many different angles and discuss it with the grad students that all of our heads were spinning, because we couldn't really comprehend all these different ways that he was looking at it. He was just a genius in the scientific approach. And also, I always call him the voice of God, because I would be sometimes on the third floor of a different building, and I would hear his voice from the first floor. And it was one of these voices that if you were giving a presentation and you hear this voice in the back of the room, it would literally make you shake in your shoes, because when you hear that voice, you feel, I have to definitely answer this in a way that makes not only scientific sense, but also in a very coherent, concise fashion. Because Dr. Rechtschaffen could cut through all that, and then he could say, well, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And like I said, he would just make your head spin. And I was just privileged to participate in his work on sleep deprivation. And although he spent years and decades working on that question, although he didn't finally be able to answer the question of sleep, question of the function of sleep, he was able to get more into the study of that than than perhaps anyone else. And on top of that, he trained, countless investigators on how to scientifically evaluate sleep and sleep disorders.